Today, we will be talking with Santiago Perez, the Deputy Director of the Center for International Political Studies, to know and understand more about Cuba's foreign policy. Thank you, Santiago, for agreeing to meet us here from Havana to talk about Cuba's foreign policy.
Thank you, Laura, to give me that possibility to talk to you and your audience.
Let's start straightforward. Next year, Cuba's revolution will be celebrating its 60th anniversary, but also its foreign ministry will be celebrating its 60 years of work. So, based on this, how would you define Cuba's foreign policy?
Well, if you ask me in conceptual terms, foreign policy is the activity of any state in international relations, in its relations with other actors of the IR. The case of Cuba has a lot of specifics, its foreign policy, because it's been a foreign policy for 60 years, which is not only concentrated on interacting with different states, it's also interacting with peoples, with audiences, with forces, with political parties. So Cuban foreign policy, much more than diplomatic side, it's a comprehensive phenomenon. It's a comprehensive foreign policy that has a lot of actors inside Cuba and interacts with a lot of audiences. It has its component in diplomatic terms for sure, but also in economic terms, in political terms. So yeah, I mean, Cuban foreign policy, I would use always the term of Cuban projection, because it's more than typical every state foreign policy.
Why?
Yeah, because Cuba is Cuban projection, external projection, has to cope with different interests of Cuban society, has to cope with the different factors and actors inside the Cuba, and also because Cuban Revolution itself was an important phenomenon in the world stage, which provoked a lot of interest from people, from public opinion, from other actors. So Cuba has been always confronting the U.S., mainly U.S. blockade, U.S. hostility, and as a part of revolutionary and popular movement, it had to diversify the objects of its interaction. But for sure, yeah, its main central is to interacting with states.
Now that you mentioned that about its revolutionary way of working, some used to say, Fidel Castro, for example, that the Cuban Revolution had a revolutionary foreign policy. What's the difference, and what exactly does revolutionary mean?
Well, remember that Cuban Revolution happened at the late 50s, 59, and it was an immense change in Latin America, in the Third World. So it was part of that trend in the world in terms of changing, in terms of revolution. And since that time, the events have been transforming. So Cuba itself has been transforming. So if we talk about the Cuban system and the Cuban model as a revolution, which is a very general term in transforming society, it's been accompanied by foreign policy, revolutionary foreign policy. Remember, Laura, that foreign policy is part of internal dynamics of the society. Cuba has always been very critical of the existing order. It's what some Western experts would call revisionist foreign policy, in the sense that it's been changing, it's been advocating for change in the system, in the world system, in economic terms, in political terms, in terms of respect for international law, in terms of advocating for the interests of national liberation movements, and now for the broad interest of the masses. not only in Latin America, also in third world, also in capitalism.
Is that why Cuba has leadership in the third world?
Yeah, Cuba can say things that other persons, other leaders couldn't, because of out of its prestige, out of its sense of mission, which Cuba had in the 60s, and it's still keeping in terms of factor of changing the existing law, which are the law of world capitalism. So in that sense, it has a lot of respect, because Cuba has been, Cuban foreign policy has been characterized by the continuity, even though there have been changes, it has to adapt to different changes in the geopolitical situation in the world, but it's keeping kind of continuation in terms of not abandoning the initial principles. So that gives you a lot of prestige. That gives you a lot of predictability. And on the other hand, it's been effective. Look, the fact that the U.S. couldn't get away with Cuba, the fact that Cuba didn't give any pretext to the U.S. to invade Cuba or to make a military move, at the same time keeping resistance and keeping its, I would say, B class of power in terms of foreign policy, right? Cuba is a small country, vulnerable country, but it has a very active foreign policy. It's been pretty sophisticated.
Where that prestige comes from, apart from these things that you were mentioning before?
Oh, it comes from the example of Cuba. It's not only a question of foreign policy or the activism of Cuban leaders. It's been the question of Cuba as itself. A small country, not far away from the U.S., 90 miles away, who has resisted and who has shown a lot of gains in social sphere, education, healthcare, and which has been very principled. So people in the world hear that, even the enemies of Cuba can understand and can have to cope with that, with the prestige that Cuba had. Look in the vote in the UN. Look, it's the overall majority except Israel and the U.S. So it's not a given. You have to work with that. You have to talk to people. You have to interact with ministries of foreign affairs. You have to interact with diplomats. So it's a result of a very big effort of Cuban diplomacy to gain that vote. One would think, I mean, we Cubans are already used to that, but it's a big victory, and I would say it's a deed in international relations.
Talking about that work that Cuba does, to talk about Cuban foreign policy, there are names that you cannot take out or you cannot obviate, and those are the names of men like Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Raul Roa.
I would add Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, Raul Castro.
Why is that taken out?
Because they were at the early stage of Cuban Revolution. I mean, Fidel has been always the leader of Cuba for a lot of years, more than 50 years, and he has not always thought in terms of Cuban strategy or Cuban political moves, but also he handled that. It's quite a difficult thing to be a strategist and at the same time to be a great tactician. The same with Che Guevara, which was with Cuba only a few years at the head of different institutions in Cuba, but he was very active in traveling around, in communicating the Cuban experience to third world leaders, third world countries, his experience before he had in Latin America, and you know the resemblance of Che Guevara. It's a symbol, because the Cuban Revolution has become a symbol. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara. The same with Raul Roa, who was a professor prior to the triumph of the revolution, who had been a very active revolutionary in the 30s. Very cultivated man who was very active in the international stage. Remember his speeches in UN, in OIS in its time. The same with Raul in establishing links with the socialist camp at that time, Carlos Rafael Rodriguez. We are speaking about a team where the leadership of Fidel is obvious, but we have to think of leaders, of people who work on that, but also in terms of the background. So it's not because they were genius. It's because Cuba had a background on historical knowledge of ways of conducting foreign affairs, and yeah, I think that the sophistication and the results that Cuba has had in foreign affairs had to do with the resistance of the people. That's most important. I remember Fidel saying that the revolution was bigger than all of us together, taken together. Yeah. So it's the Cuban people responsible for that, but Fidel and the people you have mentioned, and an establishment of Cuban foreign policy. We're not talking about only leaders, yes, but beneath that there is a great mechanism.
Because I wanted to ask you, because some people say, some media said that Cuba's foreign policy, that Fidel directed every aspect of Cuban life. So as what you are telling me is that it was not only Fidel, it was a group of persons that worked together in doing that, projecting that policy.
Sure, I mean, it's foreign policy or foreign affairs, it's a very broad mechanism. If you take, for example, economic foreign policy, if you take social foreign policy, and here the role of the Cuban doctors, the role of the Cuban teachers is very important. If you take, for example, the workers' diplomacy, the organization of Cuban workers have their own specific links, or ICAP, which is for solidarity movements. You talk about women, youth organizations. So we're talking about a broad mechanism of participation, because Cuban society has been very participating more than those media say, right? And foreign policy has been an area. Let me tell you, Cubans are very familiar with foreign policy issues.
Why? Why is that?
Oh, people here, they know they
Why
care.
What would Cubans, like simple persons, who be interested in the foreign policy?
Because Cuban system is that way. I mean, remember that in the early stages, Fidel, all the time Cuban leaders were explaining that, and it took people's heart. It took people interest. I mean, the fight with the U.S. has affected all of Cubans, and Cubans are very culturally, politically culturally knowledgeable. So I'm telling you a secret. I participate here in a specific program talking about Russia, Ukraine, Europe, etc. People in the street, they come to me and ask a lot of questions. People here do know. Do care about that. They do care about everything, right? Those mass media are, completely out of touch with the Cuban reality. But foreign policy, I would say, is one of the important gains of the Cuban Revolution. We don't talk very much about that. We talk about healthcare, we talk about education, but Cuban foreign policy, it's been one of the I would say most successful deeds of the Cuban Revolution. So
can you say it's been a revolution of the foreign policy that Cuba has been doing this for 60 years? Oh, look, a revolution with compared to Cuba prior to that, and a revolution compared with Latin America, and even with the world, because remember that time when Cuba Revolution triumphed, got to power, there was a socialist camp revolution, foreign policy, there were Latin American government, foreign policy, the US, and developed capitalist. Cuba established its own way of doing foreign policy. The issue of working with public opinion, the issue of working in the world, not only in Cuba, the issue of dealing with social movements, the issue of organizing all of that. I think that's a new way of doing. And on the other time, the Cuban message, revolutionary message in terms of not being
not agree with the existing status quo. Not only at that time in Cuba for sure, and the internal changes being made, but in Latin America, in the third world, and even today. So Cuban revolution has not lost that revolutionary message, even though these 60 years, according to Chinese times, that's not too much.
Now I want to talk a little bit about you.
Sure.
Because you are deputy director of the
CIPI in Spanish,
CIPI.
which sounds a little bit funny, right? Okay.
Yes, here in Havana. And as part of your work and the rest of the team that works with you, you investigate, you forecast phenomena that go throughout the world. How does the center focuses and works together in the projection of Cuba?
Well, you know, that the sense of knowledge in Cuban foreign policy we have been talking about, it's part of the broad mechanism. For example, in Cuba was in the 70s and in the 80s until now, it was very developed centers of that kind. So the knowledge of what are the trends in the world affairs, what's happening in different regions, have been studied in Cuba. In the Cuban University of Havana and other universities, people study. Because you cannot project your action, or even you cannot react to different action from other actors if you don't know the reality. For example, I remember Fidel Castro presenting a very important book in the Non-Aligned Movement Summit on world economic trends. That was, apart from his guidance, made with a lot of Cuban researchers. Remember the whole discussion on globalization that took place in Cuba in the early 2000 years. So my center is one of the centers who work on that area, and there are a lot of centers of that type that exist in different countries. My center works, as you mentioned, more on more strategic, long-term trends and forecasts. We don't always say what's going to happen. It's crazy, right? We don't have crystal ball, but at least we try to figure out different scenarios. We work on that.
Talking about those scenarios that you try to identify, soon you'll have the Conference of Strategic Studies. Yeah. What kind of topics do you discuss there? What comes out from the discussions?
Look, there we have different panels, and in every academic conference we have people working on or presenting papers on U.S. foreign policy, on Trump phenomenon. We have people working panels on Latin America, the correlation of forces in the area. We have people working on geopolitics, what's happening in terms of different poles of power, the role of Russia, China, the whole debate right now in the commercial wars that exist. We also have some papers on the media, how they're interacting. It's pretty broad, the agenda. And we're going to have here more than 16 foreign guests, and for sure more than 70 Cuban researchers who work on that. I insist, it's not only my center, it's part of the whole program on international relations studies that exists in Cuba, and in the University of Havana is very strong on that. Other universities, there is the Center for U.S. Studies, Center for International Economic Studies. There are two of them. And the professors, there is an Institute of International Relations. We have professors there who are who do a lot of work on that. So the idea, maybe one idea the viewers would have is that Cuban foreign policy, it's a kind of systemic networking, and we are very interacting with policymakers, which is very important, and they're very knowledgeable. Sometimes I say to my colleagues, don't think that if you call yourself an academic or a professor, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know completely the situation. There are a lot of people who are policymakers in different ministries that are very knowledgeable and very intellectually capable.
talking about that exchange, because the Center for International Political Studies, works hand by hand with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with the Institute of Foreign Relations, yes, where the future Cuban diplomats are formed. How is that relation? How are Cuban diplomats prepared?
This was an idea even of Raul Roa and Fidel. Raul Roa, because he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, in order to prepare cadres, to prepare officials to interact, because you need some specifics. You need to know knowledge. You need to know economics. You need to know history. So this effort has been from the early 60s, and then that Institute of Foreign Service has been transformed into the ISRI, which is the institute you're talking about, which
yes,
is the Instituto Superior de Relaciones Internacionales, which has formed a lot of Cuban diplomats. I would say, if you take our Minister of Foreign Affairs, the majority of the leading officers graduated from that institute. But also in other ministries, they do have, for example, Ministry of Commerce, they do have their own specific formation. And yes, I mean, the practice, it's very important. So to be an academic, to go and practice, to come back, or to be a practitioner, as we'd say, come back to academia to interact. Some of foreign services call that evolving doors. So you're working in the academia, then you go to work in embassies or in ministries, and vice versa. I think that's very useful.
We are almost running out of time, but I don't want to leave out.
I'm sorry, I talked too much.
I don't want to leave out some important and very actual topic, which is the current debate of the constitutional reform. One of the things that caused a surprise is the inclusion of an entire chapter full on international relations. It's the first time, it's not usual that a constitution has a relation of all of articles of including foreign policy on its own law. Why do you think it's important for Cuba to have it?
Why not? Well, foreign policy and foreign affairs is very important for Cuba. Cuba, it's a dependent country in economics. Cuba is a country which needs to have very close relationships with different actors, and in general, Cuba cannot concentrate in itself. It's not an island in itself. It's a country where foreign policy and foreign affairs are very important. We have the Americans side by side, so you have to give importance, priority to foreign affairs and to international affairs, because it's very important for your own order, internal order. I remember I was telling you that foreign policy is a derivative of internal order, and the power of the revolution inside has been reflected outside. Look, there you put, for example, the issue of the principle of foreign policy. You put what you mentioned in terms of favor of liberation movements, or the demands of the third world. You have there the issue of human rights, real human rights, not the Western type of discriminative way of looking at human rights. There is the issue of integration in Latin America, which is a very long-standing...
Talking about Latin American integration, on this project of constitution, in this chapter,
yeah,
they talk about this, the interest of Cuba of promoting that integration, that Latin American Caribbean integration, but also on the juridical order of the principles stated on international treaties.
Yeah.
Why do you think Cuba thinks it's important to have it on its constitution?
Because it's a small country and a Latin American country. So if you're a small country, if you're not a big power, you need the international order, you need the international law, you need the role of the organization. Look at Trump. He's exactly doing the other way because he's Trump. The U.S. thinks it's going to be the hegemon for the Pax Americana. So they're getting away from, or they're trying to get away from that international order and the role of law. So Cuba gave that importance, very much importance to that. I think it's the way of small countries, Latin American countries, third world countries, to defend itself against the law of the jungle. Because if you don't have order, if you don't have rules, they're going to impose their power. And Latin American integration, because you cannot realize yourself being single country isolated. But it's a general, more strategic desire and concept. If you don't get that integration, because now look at Latin America, what's happening, then you have to develop yourself anyway. So that's why in that part of the Constitution you mentioned, it's the relation of Cuba with the countries that respect Cuba. For example, the European countries or the most developed countries in the capitals with whom Cuba has normal mutual interest relations. The same, there is a very important paragraph on multipolarism, which is the relations of Cuba with different poles of the international relation. Cuban foreign policy is very witty in that, trying to diversify its relations, trying to avoid dependence from a single country. We had our history, and you have to avoid that from a single market, for a single product. So part of Cuban foreign policy also includes multilateral fora. It's, modestly, I think that Cubans are pretty strong on that. So Latin American integration is of paramount importance. It's part of the legacy, right? From the Jose Marti, from Bolivar, then Hugo Chavez, and all Latin American thinkers. And I'm not talking only in terms of social changes, which is obvious. I'm talking in terms of geopolitics, in terms of strategic thinking, in terms of the role and the place we're going to play in the world.
Well, Santiago,
it's already, are we getting
we're done.
Out of time?
We're out of time now.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much for meeting us from Havana, and we hope that we'll meet you again on our screens, on Telesur screens. So thank you very much, and we hope that the forecast for Latin America and the Caribbean for the coming season are better.
We are going to invite you to our conference. Laura, thank you, and thank you to the viewers of Telesur. I think that Telesur is part of that, the sense of Latin American integrating its efforts, not only in foreign policy, but also in the media fair. It's part of our necessity. Thank you.
Thank you.